Well, it's official. Mercedes have confirmed their driver lineup for 2026, and they are sticking with George Russell and Kimi Antonelli going forward. Well, with me is our F1 editor, Lewis Larkham, to break down all the latest news. Lewis, I think this is probably a slightly unsurprising move, but first of all, give us your initial thoughts. What are you thinking about Mercedes' move to keep on their two drivers from this year?
Yeah, it's probably one of the worst kept secrets in F1 for the last few months. We've kind of known that this is the way things are going to be. I think it was back at the Dutch Grand Prix in Zandvoort where Toto Wolff effectively confirmed there and then that the intention was obviously to stick with George and Kimi for next season. But the official announcement hadn't obviously been made. That the deals hadn't been signed, as it were, but that there was no doubt that these deals would happen. This is obviously sort of giving some context to this. This has been running on for several months now, and largely was a result of initially Mercedes having that interest in Max Verstappen. So until we got to, I think it was the end of July when Max Verstappen finally confirmed, even though he's under contract, it's crazy in a way that we're in this situation where drivers are having to confirm they'll stay at a team when we know they are contracted to those teams. There are all sorts of potential exit clauses and stuff for Verstappen's contract. But fundamentally, he said in July he would be staying at Red Bull next season. And from that moment, it then shut the door on the prospect of that move happening for Mercedes. So from the end of July, it was pretty clear that Mercedes would stick with George Russell and Kimi Antonelli for 2026. It was just a matter of when that announcement we made. I think Toto Wolff referred to that in the press release. It was always a case of when, not if. So we finally reached that point. It's taken a bit longer than I think everyone expected. But yeah, not surprising news.
Yeah, as you say, it's not really a massive surprise, but there was this kind of air of when is this going to be officially confirmed and is there something else going wrong that we don't know about in the background? But that doesn't really seem to be the case now, Lewis. We know that George Russell, obviously, on the back of a superb performance in Singapore, I guess that was why so many people were asking the question as to why has he not been locked down with Mercedes yet. Now, I think you can give us a little bit more clarity. I think initially a lot of people thought this was just a one-year deal for George, but that isn't the case.
Yeah, so yeah, initially in Mercedes' press release, it sort of the wording inferred that this was for 2026. As I understand it, George Russell has signed a multi-year deal with Mercedes. The exact details of this, obviously, we don't know. These kind of things are always kept secret, but it isn't just a one-year deal for George. In Kimi's case, it seems that it is a one-year deal. I think on Kimi's side, the contract situation is a bit more nuanced. Mercedes are, not getting into the ins and outs of things like specifics around, contract clauses and lengths and all that kind of thing. But certainly in George Russell's case, this seems to be a multi-year deal, which is what he ultimately wanted. He's made it clear from the start that his intention is to remain with Mercedes for years to come. And of course, when he was first signed up by Mercedes, he'd been nurtured through their junior program for the last decade or so. And he was always seen as the sort of future of Mercedes and the star of the future for them and the sort of long-term successor to Lewis Hamilton, which is kind of what we saw sort of emerging over those last few years when they were together as teammates. And George was obviously beating Lewis at the end of that time. So I think from Russell's side, it seems like he's now got what he wanted. I think there was obviously some hold-ups in terms of the exact details, the finer specifics of the lengths of the contracts and any sort of potential clauses and stuff. I think there's an element here of both sides will be wanting to cover their own backs and give each other what they want, but also Russell's got to think about his long-term future, and he wouldn't have ideally wanted to sign a deal that was only for a year and not having that long-term security. So it seems from what we know so far that he has maybe achieved that long-term security that he's been after. And Mercedes have obviously got, one of the best performing drivers this season, possibly top three drivers of the season so far. His performances have been super impressive this year. He's obviously just got his second win of the season in Singapore with that impressive drive there, and he's always maximized everything from the Mercedes. Obviously, the Mercedes this year has been, as has sort of been the story for the last couple of years, really very unpredictable, very up and down. But when it has been competitive, he has made the most of it, and we got that sort of demonstrated in both Canada and again in Singapore, where he was there to take the win. And his stock has only risen further this year. And he's now got that contract that he was seeking and that fundamentally he deserves. I think it's sort of a clear indication of retaining that partnership going forwards.
Yeah, it really feels like that George, a lot of the talk in the last couple of weeks specifically has been that he has been one of the standout drivers this season. But I mean, looking back over the course of his career with Mercedes, he has been a fantastic driver over the last few years as well. I've mentioned a couple of times before in the past that he had a lot of things stacked against him. Of course, going up against Lewis Hamilton was always going to be a tall order. He really proved that he was able to do that too. And then this year was another kind of defining year for him to step into that team leader role, which I think he's done very well. He's managed to mentor Kimi Antonelli, who we'll get onto shortly next. But he really has kind of reaffirmed his commitment to that team. And I think, as you said, Lewis, this is kind of an indication that maybe this was just a case of them dotting their I's and crossing their T's. George obviously had a few things that he wanted maybe nailed down in the contract, and the same with Mercedes, but it does feel like that commitment now is there with this multi-year contract, as you say. Yes, the Max Verstappen question was always there, but once that was shut down, I think this definitely paves the way for Mercedes to kind of have a clear vision of what they want to do with George over the next few years. But I guess that does leave a little bit of a question mark around Kimi Antonelli. Obviously, a lot of hype around Kimi heading into this season. It's been, I think it's fair to say, a bit of a rocky season for Kimi this year as a rookie. Very young to be stepping into such a big team. He has had some flashes of greatness as well, but he has struggled at times too. And this is the team committing to him for another year. But I mean, Lewis, do you think from 26 beyond it could be a little bit shaky for Kimi? And what does he have to do between the end of this season and next season to kind of, I suppose, secure his place long term in that team?
Yeah, you're right. It has been a tough sort of up and down, rocky rookie season for Kimi Antonelli this season. But I think that's fundamentally what Mercedes were always expecting. Yes, there was a lot of hype coming around him going into his first season. We'd seen what a stellar junior career he'd had and all the success he'd achieved at such a young age. And it was I think Mercedes were guilty in a way. I think Toto Wolff has admitted to this, of hyping him up too much, perhaps, because there's all this talk of sort of the next Max Verstappen that they've managed to sign. And it's not quite gone that way so far, but there have been those flashes of promise. He started the season very strongly. And I think in some ways, I think he's exceeded expectations, but then that has been overshadowed by this really torrid run of form throughout the European season that has kind of then brought those question marks into whether, it was too soon to promote him to F1, whether he was ready. And he's had a really rough run of form throughout the European season. But there have been signs recently that he's turned that around. We saw in both Azerbaijan and Singapore, particularly with Singapore being a brand new circuit for him. I think it was a really strong showing there. Obviously, Russell sort of grabbed the headlines with his drive, deservedly so, to victory, but it was a strong drive to fifth place for Kimi, and really just building on a couple of solid, clean weekends, which is what he's needed, because I spoke to him a few races ago, actually, in Belgium, and we were sort of chatting through his season and really sort of stemming back to that crash he had in practice in Monza last year, how he's kind of always been sort of trying to find that balance of finding the edge but not going over it. And sometimes he's almost been, he said he's been a bit cautious, he's held back a little bit too much. And I think he's had that battle of trying to find the limit, find the edge, and then you've got the added scrutiny, the question marks, all of which is new territory for him, under a lot of pressure in a big team. I think it's been a combination of those factors. He's also mentioned how sort of time management and trying to limit sort of sponsor commitments and media interviews and time with friends and family and all of those kind of outside factors have maybe played a bit of an influence, particularly during the early rounds of the European season. But he's really sort of managed to turn that around. And I think there's some positive signs that if he can keep these kind of performances up, that's exactly what Mercedes want to see from him now. They want to see those sort of solid, clean weekends where he's bagging strong points, potentially competing for podiums, but fundamentally that will depend on the competitiveness of the Mercedes. I think going to next season, obviously that's a huge question mark in terms of we don't know who's going to be where. There's obviously a lot of rumours that Mercedes are going to be one of the leading contenders with their power unit particularly, and they obviously have good history there in terms of creating a strong power unit, as we saw throughout this era of the early part of this era of regulations, how they dominated there. So I think obviously a lot, again, expectations will be reset next year, and fundamentally that will depend on just how competitive Mercedes are and what the pecking order and the competitive landscape looks like next year. I think the expectations will go up. Clearly, if Mercedes are fighting for victories and world championships, there will be more pressure on Kimi to deliver those results. But I think ultimately Mercedes have backed, like Russell, have backed Kimi from a young age, and he is seen as their sort of protege, their long-term investment. And I don't think there was ever really a doubt that he would have stayed for next season, because they acknowledged they put him in this tricky scenario, sort of throwing him in at the deep end, and see how he performs. And I think overall he's done a good, a decent job. Next year's another ball game altogether. There won't be that sort of, not excuse, but fallback of, well, this is his rookie season, he's learning. I think those kind of mistakes are, they need to be happening this season and not next season. That will then determine his long-term future. I think Mercedes would love it to work out, obviously, for their young driver who they've nurtured to come through, and to have two of their own junior drivers leading their team going forward, I think is ultimately their sort of dream scenario. But then there is also the Max Verstappen question mark, which I don't think that's going to go away just because of these new deals. I think Mercedes have made it quite clear that they're interested in Max, and they will remain interested in Max, and they would be stupid to not explore any possibilities that may emerge. And I think next year is a huge year for Red Bull and for Max Verstappen's future as well, depending on just how competitive Red Bull are when Ford come on board and they're creating their own power unit. I think Verstappen's future, sort of 2027 and beyond, will be determined probably in the early months of next season. And if he decides that he wants to leave Red Bull and then has those break clauses and exit clauses we've heard being speculated about, that we know we don't quite know the exact terms of them, but we know they exist within his contract. And if there is an opportunity for him to leave and he decides to do that, Mercedes will be one of the potential destinations that he would surely be looking at, particularly if Mercedes are competitive, as I think everyone is kind of expecting them to be. And Mercedes would also have to consider that. So that's where things will get interesting, I think, going sort of next season, this time next year particularly, probably earlier, is when things will get really interesting, because we will see, depending, obviously, a lot of this will depend on how Russell and Antonelli are stacking up against each other, but we will see, whether Antonelli has stepped up and made those kind of performance gains, and if Verstappen is on the market, has he done enough to retain his seat, or do we suddenly see question marks re-emerging about Antonelli's future? Because I suppose if Russell is signed on a long-term deal and the sort of team leader and continues that next year, then it would be Antonelli's seat rather than his that is perhaps under scrutiny and under pressure if there's an opportunity to sign Verstappen. However, if Antonelli has an incredible season or is outperforming Russell, then we will get to see just how much that multi-year deal, I guess, how much that means. We always say in F1 that contracts aren't really worth the paper they're written on, and we've seen plenty of examples of those contracts ending and being torn up and thrown away, and drivers replacing rivals and moves that we didn't foresee happening. So I think, but that is ultimately a longer term question mark, and a lot of it is hypothetical and speculation at this stage until we really see how things go. But there's no doubt that next year will be a big year in terms of the Verstappen dynamic in his future, and Mercedes will be involved in that pictures one way or another.
Yeah,
You'd imagine.
definitely. Feels like a bit of stability for now, and then 26 really does feel like that year where there could be some seriously seismic changes.